Welcome to More or Less, Debating America's Role in the World, a series of online debates brought to you by the Charles Koch Institute and the Brookings Institution's Foreign Policy Program. This series aims to foster vigorous, civil, and constructive debate on the future of American foreign policy. We break down big topics into bite-sized pieces, one question at a time.
Hello, my name is Adam Twardowski. I'm a senior research assistant at the Brookings Institution. Today, you're joining us for the second installment of our new series where we bring you short debates between scholars on big topics in foreign policy. You will find the full series at the link that will appear at the end of this recording. I will now pose today's debate question, which touches something that is affecting the world order in significant ways. Does China's rise threaten America's interests in East Asia? Representing Brookings today, we have Lindsey Ford, who is a David Rubinstein Senior Fellow at the Foreign Policy Program, the Center for East Asian Policy Studies at Brookings. And representing today the Center for the National Interest, we have Paul Heer, who is a distinguished fellow there and also a non-resident senior fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. The rules of today's debate are simple. You each have 5 minutes to state your case before it goes to the other side. You may not interrupt each other, and we have the power to mute you and are not afraid to use it. It will then go back to each side for a 1-minute rebuttal, and then back to each side finally for a 1-minute conclusion. Today, we're going to start with Lindsey. Lindsey, does China's rise threaten U.S. interests in East Asia? You have 5 minutes starting now.
Thank you so much, Adam. Pleasure to be here. I'm going to argue that China's rise is not an inherent threat to the United States in and of itself, but the question that matters is how China intends to pursue its interests on the global stage. And the record is quite clear, I think, that China is not content with various elements of the existing regional order in Asia, and that sustaining this existing order is something that is inherent to U.S. interests in the region. So even if the United States was to sign up for some kind of win-win solution with China or a new type of great power relations in Asia, the question I think would be on what terms? And China's actions over the past decade suggest that these are terms that would in many places run counter to U.S. interests. Let me be specific. So first, on the security front, I think it's pretty clear that China is looking for something that is different from the status quo. Its words and actions suggest they prefer a security order that's less dependent on the United States, where the U.S. has less freedom of action and maneuver, and one in which U.S. alliances have been neutralized or eliminated. Xi has been quite explicit that U.S. alliances are not conducive to common security, and China has taken action, like it did against South Korea in response to its THAAD deployment, to explicitly coerce and warn allies about the cost of strengthening their alliances with the U.S. When you look at the types of capabilities China is investing in as well, the implications for the United States and the credibility of our alliances is clear. China is building an incredibly sophisticated ballistic missile force, for example, and most of these capabilities are designed to target the Indo-Pacific theater and limit the ability of the U.S. to come to the defense of our allies in the event of a conflict. These relationships and agreements are the foundation of America's security presence in the region. Second, when we look at China's economic activities, it's pretty clear that despite promises it made when it acceded to the WTO, it's been far more committed to sustaining its own system of state-directed capitalism than it has to the idea of economic reform or establishing a fair playing field with the US or other regional partners. Just to take a couple of data points here, China continues to heavily subsidize state-owned enterprises. It's created rules and regulations that force US companies to turn over their technology as the price of doing business with Beijing. And this really all flies in the face of what it promised when it signed up to the international trading community. Similarly, China signed an agreement with the Obama administration in its second term that committed to neither supporting or conducting cyber-enabled intellectual property theft. And yet, this cyber theft still occurs. And according to some analysis, it could add up to over $300 billion in annual losses for US companies. Finally, there's the question of values. What we've seen China do in places like Xinjiang and Hong Kong more recently is it's tried to really validate its own repression of separatism or various domestic groups under the rubric of countering extremism. And it's trying to normalize the position that what it's doing at home is the same as what the international community tries to do in countering extremists abroad. Obviously, this is a position the United States doesn't agree with, but China is trying to cultivate like-minded countries to support its position, and it's had some relative success here. We saw most recently that there were 50 different signatories in the UN that signed a letter supporting China's position in Xinjiang. Why this matters is not just because it enables what China's doing at home. It matters because it enables the next illiberal regime. It expands the precedent that you can pursue these types of activities, and Beijing and other actors will have your back. And if China is able to encourage a regional and an international system that's more accommodating of illiberalism, in which the tools and the policies that are employed by authoritarian leaders are more widespread, to me, I think that is a world and a region in East Asia that is inherently less aligned with US interests, in which our power and influence would be reduced. So in conclusion, for me, I don't think this is as simple as whether or not the United States or China needs to pursue primacy. Paul, you've really said in your writing that seeking to align the international system with your own domestic preferences is simply something that great powers do. And I totally agree with that. But for me, that itself is a big part of the problem, because China's actions flow from the CCP's own fears about domestic insecurity and vulnerability, and its own assessment of what kind of external environment it needs to achieve its goals. And that's not something America can readily control, and it may be very difficult to influence. So what matters, I think, is that in a lot of cases, these beliefs are driving policies that have important externalities in the wider region. And in many cases, those externalities are directly contrary to US interests.
Thank you, Lindsey. That was really insightful and a great start to this discussion. Paul, I'm going to turn it over to you right now. Same question. Does China's rise threaten US interests in East Asia? Your 5 minutes begins right now.
Yes, Adam, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and as part of this discussion, particularly with Lindsey, whose views I've respected for a long time. As usual, I find myself in agreement with most of what she said, but I think we'll be able to find a few things to debate here. On the question of whether China's rise threatens U.S. interests in East Asia, the first thing I would say is that I think of China's rise as more of a challenge than as a threat to U.S. interests in the region. Basically because I don't think the contest between the two countries is an existential one. Now, having said that, I agree, and I think this is consistent with Lindsey's presentation, that it is a profound and unprecedented challenge. It's a strategic competition between two superpowers for wealth and power and influence, and Beijing's trying to maximize its share of all of those things relative to the United States. But I don't actually think the Chinese are trying to, as a lot of people suggest, kick the U.S. out of East Asia. Now, it's true that the Chinese would like the U.S. military presence in the region to go away because they believe its primary purpose is to contain China. And I frankly don't think we're ever going to be able to convince them otherwise on that point. But the bottom line, in my view, is that I don't think the Chinese seriously believe they could eliminate any U.S. role in East Asia, or that they really want to. The other reason I make this distinction between a threat and a challenge is this. If we approach China as an existential threat, I think this will lead us toward a more confrontational and even hostile strategy toward it, which I frankly think is the wrong prescription based on the wrong diagnosis of the problem. On the other hand, if we approach China as a challenge, I think this can lead to the more reasonable and appropriate response of mobilizing our resources and our energies to compete with China, while I should add at the same time looking for ways to avoid conflict and to cooperate with China when our mutual interests are served by doing so. Now, the second part of your question is whether China's rise challenges our interests in East Asia. I agree with Lindsey that the obvious answer to that is yes, but I think we need to be clear and careful in specifying what our interests in the region actually are. And I actually think we're at risk of oversubscribing here a little bit. Clearly, and this is consistent with some of the things that Lindsey said, clearly we want to maintain our access to East Asia for economic and diplomatic and security reasons. We want to uphold prosperity and stability and promote democracy there. And we want to maintain our alliance relationships because they've become part of the framework that makes all of this possible. But I think it becomes highly problematic, and Lindsey alluded to this, if we define our interests, as I think we do today, to include maintaining U.S. primacy in East Asia. Because I frankly don't think U.S. primacy in East Asia is a vital interest. I don't think it's necessary to ensure either our economic interests or security in the region. But more importantly, because I don't think it's frankly sustainable. Now, our interests in East Asia have often been framed in terms of preventing the rise or the emergence of a hostile, exclusive rival hegemon in the region. And we generally presumed that the only guarantee against this is maintaining our own hegemony there. But this is where Lindsey and I may disagree a little bit. I frankly don't think China is seeking either hostile or exclusive hegemony in East Asia. I think the Chinese are looking for some version of peaceful coexistence in overlapping spheres of influence because they genuinely want, and I think calculate that they need a peaceful external environment, if only because this would allow them to focus on their domestic priorities. Now, the reason I say U.S. primacy in East Asia is not sustainable is simply because the regional balance of power is already shifting historically. We can't pretend that it's 1945 anymore, or even 1991 when the Cold War ended. We need to make some adjustments to this historical reality. And I think defining our interest in terms of something that is not sustainable, perpetual U.S. primacy in East Asia is not going to be a safe bet. So getting back to my earlier point, we can either respond to this new historical situation in a confrontational and I think counterproductive way, or we can start looking for ways to achieve a stable balance of power in the region, which I think, frankly, is going to probably require some kind of mutual accommodation with China. Now, I agree with Lindsey that China is a threat to the liberal international order. This is a valid concern because the Chinese, when Beijing talks about reform of global governance, they are talking about legitimizing China's model of governance and economic development and promoting Beijing's way of doing business in the region and in the world, and Beijing's interpretation of international law. But my caveat is I don't think this means Beijing is trying to impose its model on other countries. The Chinese actually don't really care how other countries govern themselves as long as they let the CCP govern China. And in fact, many of China's most lucrative relationships, including within the region, are with democratic capitalist countries. And Beijing actually doesn't get along always that well with some of its communist neighbors. Let's just look at their relationships with North Korea and Vietnam. Well, I'll leave it at there for now. But I think I agree with Lindsey. But I'm just wondering on the general thrust of the challenge that China poses. But we may have a point to debate on how extensive the ideological threat is.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was fascinating. As you said, there was some really interesting overlap between you two on a couple key points, but also some clear distinctions, and those distinctions could have some really interesting implications for policymakers. And so, Lindsey, I'm going to turn it over to you right now for your 1 minute to 2 minutes or so rebuttal on Paul's presentation and whether you have any additional points to make.
Yes, thanks, Adam. Paul, thoughtful remarks as always. I'm not at all surprised. So I guess I'll follow up on a couple of points. So Paul, you said that we don't necessarily have to have an existential threat between the United States and China. I actually agree with that. But what I would say is, despite the fact that U.S. policymakers have said that over and over again, I'm not convinced that Chinese leaders see it that way. Because I think in a lot of their behavior and the actions they've taken, they believe that there is an existential threat to the CCP and its longevity. And so when we talk about peaceful coexistence, while that might be nice, I guess, again, my question is peaceful coexistence on whose terms? And while China may not want to kick the United States out of East Asia entirely, I think it certainly would like for the United States to have to operate and exist in East Asia on China's terms and its definition of what peaceful coexistence looks like. And I think you can see this on several fronts. So, for example, the steps that China has taken in the Code of Conduct negotiations in the South China Sea to essentially say that it would like for all claimants in the South China Sea to have to agree to any types of operations and military activities with external actors. Clearly, basically seeks to give Beijing a veto over what the United States could do militarily in the maritime domain in East Asia. Secondly, I think, as I said before, operating inside of China for NGOs, for journalists, for US businesses have to be on terms that China sees as advantageous to its own interests. And in many cases, these are disadvantageous terms to US interests. And then finally, I guess when we talk about peaceful coexistence, I look at things like China's efforts to establish de facto sovereignty in the South China Sea over the territorial claims of its partners in the region. to take steps to interfere domestically in the political activities of countries like Australia, or to enable corrupt leaders in places like Malaysia. And I guess here, it seems like perhaps that's peaceful coexistence as China defines it for Beijing, but I would question whether other countries in the region see it that way.
Thank you, Lindsey. Over to you, Paul, for your response to Lindsey's rebuttal.
Oh, you raised many very interesting points, and we could talk about them for days. I agree with all of the points, a lot of the points you made about the terms on which China wants peaceful coexistence to happen. On the issue you raised, interestingly, of the CCP's perception of an existential threat from the United States, I think that is the other side of the coin that I was talking about. Especially, I think, frankly, the Chinese could be excused for perceiving an existential threat to the CCP after listening to Secretary of State Pompeo's speech last week about the imperative of changing China and the nature of the regime. But my bottom line is that I think we arguably may pose a more existential threat to their leading, their governing regime than I think they genuinely pose to ours. I mean, that's a separate point that gets into U.S. policy. I think you also make excellent points about China's terms for the relationship. I mean, obviously, as I said, Chinese are trying to maximize their power and influence and wealth in the region relative to ours. And I think the challenge there, if we're going to be able to pursue some kind of stable balance of power with them, is what kind of relationship or accommodations, or I should say, arrangements we can work out between Beijing and Washington in terms of what the balance of power should be and what the terms of engagement will be. I think the Chinese do look in terms, I think they do aspire to some, frankly, version of the Monroe Doctrine in the region, where no outside power engages in the region in a way that's inimical to China's interests or threatens its interests. And none of the neighbors, with or without external support, challenge China's interest. Obviously, that's not going to be wholly acceptable to us. But I think the challenge there will be determining, what's the balance of power going to be? How is this going to work? And I think you're right to point out the centrality of the third countries in the region as the arena for this competition and the need for engagement across the board. I think you've all heard that the countries in the region don't want to choose sides necessarily, but they have some choices to make, and I think so do we and the Chinese.
Okay, we've reached our conclusion. Lindsey, we're going to turn it over to you now for your concluding thoughts, 1 to 2 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to Paul.
Great, thank you again, Adam. So I guess where I just want to conclude, and I would first, I guess, say that in response to Paul's point about how China may view Secretary Pompeo's recent speech, I agree. They might see many of the comments in that speech as an existential threat to the CCP. But I also think that Secretary Pompeo's speech is not necessarily the line in the rhetoric that we have seen coming from the United States over the past decade or two, in which China has taken a lot of the actions that I outlined earlier. So to me, again, the question is one of the existing order and whether we sustain a lot of the status quo that we have seen in that order over the past 70 years, or whether we have one that looks fundamentally different. To me, the existing order that we have in East Asia is one that has not just benefited the United States over everyone else. It's actually an order that has benefited everyone in the region. And I think you see this in the support that other countries in the region continue to offer for the principles and the security relationships and the free flow of economic trade that is underpinned this order. Importantly, it's an order that has also actually supported China's own economic development. I mean, Beijing doesn't always like to talk about this as much, but the fact that the United States security presence has helped prevent further great power conflict in the region, the fact that we helped institute a system of free and open trade in the region and shared principles has unequivocally contributed to the stability of East Asia. And that stable environment is something that has enabled Beijing in many ways to continue to pursue the economic rise that it has enjoyed. So finally, I guess I would just say that I see the status quo of the existing order as something that benefits all countries in the region. And again, that the steps that China is taking to alter certain terms of engagement and elements of that order is something that would fly in the face of US interests and the interests of many countries in the region.
All right, Paul, over to you for your concluding remarks. Thank you, Lindsey.
Well, thank you, Lindsey. Actually, on your final point, I would wholly agree. I would agree, and I think the Chinese would agree, that the status quo order for decades has also served China's interests. And I think that's the reason why the Chinese are receptive to pursuing some kind of peaceful coexistence or overlapping spheres of influence where we can work out a modus vivendi. I guess my bottom line to conclude, to wrap up, would be that I agree that China obviously is a challenge to our interests there. But one of my central points is that I think we should not exaggerate the nature and the scope of the challenge. I think we just need to be very accurate and analytical about diagnosing the problem and having, I think, a more empirical assessment of China's strategic intentions and ambitions, and I think is reflected among a lot of voices in Washington. And I also think we simply need, as I alluded to earlier, to rationalize our goals and our expectations, because we can't dictate what the region looks like we kind of could in 1945. And most importantly, I think we can't take other countries in the region, especially our allies, for granted. We need to recognize that they're already starting to hedge because of their own uncertainty about the reliability and the sustainability of the U.S. role in the region. I think we need to restore their confidence in that. And frankly, I think the best way for the United States to compete against this challenge from China is to offer a more, competitive role and a more appealing role model to other countries. But just as an aside, I think as of now, this is going to require us to get our act together and start projecting a better example of reliability and stability, frankly, in the region than we currently see.
Right, and that concludes our debate today on the question of whether China's rise threatens America's interests in East Asia. Really great points on both sides. Thank you to the audience for watching this installment of More or Less, Debating America's Role in the World, a project of the Charles Koch Institute and the Brookings Institution. I'm Adam Twardowski. Special thanks to our guests today, Lindsey Ford, David Rubinstein Fellow in the Foreign Policy Program, and to Paul Heer, a Distinguished Fellow at the Center for National Interest and a non-resident Senior Fellow, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. We hope you join us next time for our next debate. And again, thank you for watching.
Thanks so much, Adam.
Thank you. And thank you, Lindsey.
Thank you, Paul.